Hello, everybody. I'm Simon Harrison from the Department of English at City University of Hong Kong. Thank you very much for attending our talk. I'm just going to share my slides. You might be attending because you're curious about the relationship between Korean pop and coffee and aircon. Well, we'll be explaining that. These are some of the ingredients that we found in a language-related episode that we discovered in China. I'm pleased to be presenting this on behalf of my co-authors, David Fleming from the University of Stirling and Yuhua Chen from Coventry University. We think that this example that we'll share helps to problematize language policy and practice in EMI and transnational higher education. A few background slides. We'll explain where we found our example. We will walk you through the example with some fine-grained analysis, and then we'll discuss some of those ingredients that we find there. To begin with some broad brushstrokes, we could point out with Spolsky that language policy can be seen as consisting of at least three components. Those are the language practices, the language beliefs or ideologies, and the specific attempts at language intervention, planning, or management. And we can think of policy negotiation research as ways of addressing the interplay between these three and other aspects of language policy. So let's have a look at a few studies of language policy negotiation. Mortensen's research is very well known. He looked at the interaction between students in groups on an international campus in Denmark. And the way he conceptualized policy negotiations was that on the one hand, you have language policy and language enforcement, the enforcement of language policies coming top down, but the actual practice of the students in the groups creating their own language policies ad hoc, bottom up, and policy negotiations could be seen as this area of interaction between top down and bottom up practices and policies. So it's kind of a vertical modeling of policy negotiation. Other researchers have adopted a more ecologically oriented perspective on students' negotiation of language policies. So for instance, Oh, Gu, and Holt have analyzed an episode of informal interaction between students from different socio-cultural and linguistic backgrounds interacting on an international university in China, on the campus of an international university of China. And they prefer to talk about translanguaging spaces and the kind of repertoires that students, the different repertoires partially overlapping that students have. So they show how the students employed an integrated repertoire of linguistic resources to communicate, and their configurations of resources shifted according to the perceived spatial relations. So they're not like fixed interactions or axes that we can impose on these language policy negotiations, but they are adaptive to the actual repertoires of the speakers who end up interacting with each other. And they also noted that the way this happened actually flouted the institutional norm of immersing the students in English because they incorporated all their multilingual resources into their English as a lingua franca communication. Han, Da Costa, and Sway explicitly extended ecological approaches in second language acquisition by Van Leer to examining policy practice interface. For them, they wanted to include the embodied aspects of language learning and the crucial role that the ecology in which a learner is situated plays in shaping learning. So what they did in this study was to track or trace the development of a Uyghur student's proficiency and fluency in Mandarin Putonghua as they encountered these various spaces for language policy negotiation, therefore seeing the students' encounters with policy as grounded not only in relation to the embodied and material realities of those different spaces, but within a wider historical, geographical, and political trajectory of the student. In our recent research, we've wanted to point out that these language policy negotiations can be seen as a kind of language-related episode. Now, language-related episodes are well known in the area of applied linguistics. They're often defined as parts of the student's dialogue where they begin to talk about the language they're producing. So they shift the topic of conversation to whatever it was about to the language they're producing. They question their language use and they correct themselves or others. The corpus where we find our examples is the multimodal corpus of academic written and spoken English that was collected on the campus of an international university in China, a Sino-foreign venture. And the corpus contains approximately 30 hours of video recorded, naturally occurring group and pair work. The example that we want to show is an example of students interacting in a group. They are master's students. Before they enter their master's program, so it's a pre-sessional English for academic purposes class, the students are either there because they didn't meet the IELTS 6.5 requirement and entry requirement, or because they wanted practice and training in academic English. All the students in this example happen to be from China, so they're either at or above or somewhere below IELTS 6.5 level. And in this example, the teacher is from England and he's speaking in a form of British English. And then we'll walk you through the microanalysis that has been transcribed with fairly standard conventions for spoken language and gesture. So for gesture, we were looking at the timing of the gesture in relation to speech and its different phases. What we're going to see here is the group of students come across a pronunciation issue with the difference between the letters J and G, especially the student at the head of the table there, Lee. You're going to see that she encounters some struggling with that. The students begin to help her. You'll see that Bai and Sun on the left offer all kinds of assistance, modeling the form for her, giving her the correct pronunciation, but also gesturing and dancing along with this. But interestingly, what you will hear as well is the teacher in the background begin to enforce the English-only policy of the classrooms. The students respond to this. A second activity gets underway, which is the teacher eliciting the answers from the group as a whole. And you'll see that the students come back to negotiating the difference between J and G in the background. And then at the very end of the clip, you see that the teacher also comes back to this issue between J and G. The first interesting thing we want to draw your attention to is that when the student begins struggling there with the letter J, the peers immediately jump in and begin to help, offering the correct form in line 2, shouting that in line 3, and then also switching to Chinese to say, J, what on earth? So Lee, the student who was struggling, questions this G, rising, falling intonation. And this is when you hear the teacher, presumably attending to that sentence in Chinese by Sun, saying, English ladies, English. And at the same time, you see Sun now begin to dance with this GGG thing. Okay. Next, what you'll see is Lee seems to ignore this GGG dance and says, well, what about this one then? And draws a J in the gesture space with her finger there, J. And all the group at this point replying chorus, J. And you even see the student next to her produce the same gesture, although she has a pen in her hand, so it's a bit different. And after that, you see Bai kind of nod her head. Oh, okay. It's quite faint in the recording there. Play that one more time. Okay. In the next segment, what's interesting here is that Sun repeats this idea of, it's a mnemonic where she's saying you can remember the pronunciation of G by remembering that Korean song, the GGG, and she again sings that and moves her body as well, though this time it's not the full gesture that she makes. And now the teacher kind of interrupts them here with English, that's in line 17. Ladies, English, please. The falling intonation there is kind of a bit of exasperation we can hear on behalf of the teacher. The original student, Lee, yeah. And Sun also says yes, and you hear her put the coffee cup down. I want you to listen carefully to that. It's not a slam, but she sets it down audibly on the table and then says yes, and makes this interesting kind of baton gesture with her finger. And then the teacher kind of upgrades this reprimand to the whole class. Right, guys, come on, I said after week 1, I shouldn't have to remind you about this. English in class, please. And then transitions into the elicitation exercise.
English, ladies, English. Yes. Guys, come on, I said after week 1, I shouldn't have to remind you about this. English in class, please. Okay, so
I think we can have one more look at that clip, because you can see the putting down of the coffee cup, the yes, and then that interesting gesture like that. Play that again.
English, ladies, English. Yes. Guys, come on, I said after week 1, I shouldn't have to remind you about this. English in class, please. Okay, so.
And just in the final segment here, the teacher gets the elicitation exercise underway, but Lee and Sun continue to negotiate this issue about J and G, performing the tracing gestures again. The teacher continues to drill the answer, and yeah, and this isn't included on this last clip here, but if you think back to when I showed you the clip at the beginning, the teacher does actually come back to that difference between J and G at the end and says, don't get your J's and your G's mixed up. But here, just pay attention to the way that Lee and Sun continue to negotiate this kind of under the radar as the teacher gets the elicitation exercise underway.
About this, English in class, please. Okay, so let's, okay, right, give it to you. Attitude, what's that? Success. Yeah, D for Delta. Capability.
Thought we'd end that with a swig of coffee. Okay. Now, obviously, it's a really rich piece of data, and there are lots of directions that we could take it in. We mentioned ingredients of a language-related episode at the beginning. We could just talk about the K-pop and the coffee, and there's something to do with aircon here that we'll bring in as well. It's actually from the song GG Baby by Korean pop group Xiao Nu Shadai. And let's show you the music video there, because this is where the gesture comes from.
My first love story. My angel and the girls, my sunshine.
Okay, so you could see the GGG dance there that found its way into the language-related episode, and that was part of this policy negotiation. So we think this, on the one hand, of course, it highlights the kind of resources and references that Chinese students are mobilizing in their interactions during this language-related episode, but also the cultural flows and desires that are animating their gestures, their postures, and their expressions of these students at international universities today. From the perspective of teaching and learning, we could follow Goyen and Pennycook in interpreting the way these students are drawing and dancing out meanings as communicative strategies to ensure they're understood. This was the case in their research, where one of their interviewees said that it seems like I'm dancing to illustrate my idea because my English is not good. Sometimes the teacher doesn't understand. I have to even draw and explain. Now, the students in our example seem to understand each other perfectly well. So the gesture is not primarily being used as a strategy to make up for proficiency or fluency, as gestures are often seen to be functional in that way, in this kind of context. Rather, we see that the way the students' bodies are moving offer evidence of the relationships between policy negotiations and wider cultural flows, which in this case include those Romanized alphabetical letters and Korean pop music.
Ladies, English, please.
Yes.
Right, guys, come on, I said.
We can do that by pointing out that there is a Starbucks coffee on this international campus, and that the student who we managed to have a follow-up interview with told us that she always lattes. She gets coffee on the way to class 60% to 80% of the time. She likes the milk. She always lattes. So it's not necessarily the buzz of the caffeine that she's interested in, although she did say that coffee makes her not feel sleepy, only mental stuff. So there's a psychological aspect to it. But she also said that she drinks coffee to keep warm because of the air conditioning in the classrooms, which we thought was interesting, which, you know, it brings ambient temperatures and embodied experiences further into their relation with this language policy and language related episode. And she'd also developed a habit of having afternoon coffee. It's interesting when we consider the relationship between consumption of coffee and consumption of Sino-foreign education, which is part of the changing landscape of transnational higher education in China, where we see that there are interesting parallels to draw here between Starbucks coming into China and Sino-foreign ventures coming in. And Peter da Costa has informally drawn amusing and insightful parallels between the international universities and their students' well-known aspirations to only Western-based models for both English language on the one hand, and we also see their preference for Starbucks coffee on the other hand. So some final thoughts on conceptualizing the policy negotiation. We could see, along with Mortensen, policy enforcement from above, language practice from below. We could conceptualize policy negotiation instead in terms of translanguaging implementation spaces or ecological languaging trajectories. We hope to have shown entanglement or a meshwork following Tim Ingold's work in social anthropology, because Ingold describes different places that we go to. His example is the house, but we could use the classroom as a place where lines of its residents, which would be students and teachers in our context, are tightly knotted together, but they're not contained within the house, classroom. They're threads that leave there and trail beyond it, only to become caught up with other lines in other places. And I think that that's what we see in our example as well. We see a kind of meshwork where we can bring elements like the air conditioning, the Starbucks coffee, and the Korean pop dance moves into the language policy negotiation and try to explain what they are doing in there as well, rather than seeing them as just elements or resources being mobilized in the practices, the interactive practices of the students. So putting them more fundamentally in there as part of a meshwork. Thank you for your time and attention.